So for this video, I want to talk about the CapK a little bit more. I'm continuing the series that I was doing on it before. A lot of the stuff that I was talking about before was definitely stuff that I think helps figure for the CapK in general, and just thinking about it as a strategy and really think about how the fundamental pieces of the argument really flow together. But in this two parts video, I really want to talk about going for the CapK against KAVs and the way that I think it relates to critical affirmatives. I think this is a strategy that you'll probably see most often if you're reading critical affirmative, and it's a strategy you'll see paired with a lot of different other types of strategies, and maybe sometimes even read by itself. And so I think being able to understand how this argument is supposed to flow together and thinking about the ways that different teams can think strategically about these arguments is really important to being able to get good at being able to both go for a critical affirmative and being able to go for criticisms as a whole. Because I think the types of central questions that the CapK is asking about the affirmative are questions that you should ask with almost any criticism. And I also think that the central questions that you ask of the CapK can be really helpful for building like broad link arguments that work against like any type of team. I think that once again it's such a strong strategy because it literally links to pretty much every critical affirmative, including the ones that talk about Marxism, because there are so many different ideas that people have about how we should be organizing, what organization looks like, and what the value of doing certain types of critiques of capitalism are in relationship to the way that the world is changing. And I also think that the deeper that you get into the literature itself, it's more rewarding because there are so many different examples and authors to cite. The better you get at talking about the history and the examples of capital development and anti-capitalist resistance, the better you'll be at executing the strategy as a whole. Once again, these videos won't really cover this stuff as a literature base, and probably won't be able to talk to you like through all of the authors that you could be reading when doing all of these things. But once again, it is supposed to give you an idea and a kind of toolbox to think about how your arguments should be interact with each other and how they should be thinking about the other team's arguments and the types of things that you want to check off in order to make this argument really effective. I think against critical affirmatives, this argument is good because it can keep the debate super simple and clean by forcing the debate to be a question of praxis with framework and alternative arguments. Capitalism also intersects with a lot of other criticisms people make, thus giving this case lots of creative inroads to resolving or explaining the impacts of the AF. Throughout this video, you'll probably hear me talk a lot about proximate causes in the way that I think explanations of proximate causes are important. And I think against any critical affirmative, being able to explain the ways in which capitalism magnifies the impacts of that AF, or the way in which that the proximate causes of the affirmative can be explained in the context of the CapK can be really helpful. But I think it is distinct from going from a root cause debate. And when I go to the link debate, I'll talk a little bit more about why I think it's distinct from a root cause debate and why I think keeping it distinct from a root cause debate is really effective to actually turning these arguments into like really effective offensive strategies. But first, I want to start with the framework of the debate. I think that framework arguments are more useful here than they were against the kind of like policy teams section of the lectures that I did, because I think that this argument allows you basically to consider a way to frame the judge's ballot in a way that allows you to make good arguments about the development of praxis and the necessity of developing praxis, because there's so much urgency to the type of impacts that you'll present later on. And I think there are a lot of good framing arguments about why debate should be centered around a question of praxis. And there's so many different authors that are writing about the role that the university and academic study plays in the context of how we produce praxis, and that are writing about the relationship that the university has to capitalism, thus kind of like maybe presenting key questions and ideas about how we should think about the role that debate has in the university and the academy, and the way that it has in the types of like answers and solutions that we offer to the problem of capitalism. And I think that there are a lot of arguments you can make with like that type of framework that touch both procedural and pedagogical values, thus making it like really, really strong. I think at a procedural level, the framework arguments are really able to make sense of being able to set up certain like values that can be judged like against the AF and the alternative kind of like a lot more equally in the eyes of the judges. Being able to judge an AF just on the outcome of its praxis or the way that it produces like different modes of resolving the impacts that it cites throughout the 1AC seems intuitive and will probably be something that is appealing to a lot of judges. And I think then there's just a question of being able to fill in a lot of pedagogical gaps about why that is valuable in terms of how we think about K on KVK debates, which I think will be really, really helpful later on when you're thinking about how you want to answer the permutation, which I think I'll end up talking about in the next video. But I think you actually should spend a lot of time executing this part of the debate because it's tied in with a lot of arguments that you'll make later on, and it pretty much sets up the threshold for how you're going to argue everything else. It sets up the way in which you understand what type of link arguments are valuable and the impacts of those link arguments. It also sets up the way that you think about the impact comparison and the way that you think about what types of impacts should be valued and why we should be valuing those impacts, while inevitably trying to set up the answer to what type of political choice you should make in a world where the AF is presented against the alternative. I think at a kind of like top level overview level and structural thesis level, I think this is where you want to make the debate about praxis start, simply by pushing the urgency of the impacts, which is where like you'll see a lot of like cap overviews start, the ones that start talking about why capitalism destroys the environment, why it creates, the motivation for conflict and resource wars and scarcity and all these other things. And I think that that's a good route because it allows you to think about why doing something in the now and immediately being able to like put into practice ways of thinking through different strategies is immediately important. But I don't think this is the only route that you have to take. I think that you can make another argument about why being able to explain the relationship that the AF has to capitalism as a structure, or being able to give like a Marxist interpretation of how the AF is examining violence, I think can be another way to kind of like spin your thesis in a way that's really good with the with different types of link arguments that you want to make. I think, for instance, in the context of like being able to read racial capitalism arguments and making arguments about the specific relationship that slavery has towards the development of capital can be really good in terms of being able to make a connection between your arguments and maybe an AF that's specifically about anti-blackness, or an AF that is written in the context of Afro-pessimism, for example. The reason why I think is that it's super helpful being able to set up offense that directly contests the thesis of the affirmative with a different explanation for why violence is happening, which allows you to control a lot of the question of like what response we should make and why that response is good. And so being able to kind of control that explanation for proximate causes of violence, like I was saying before, at this portion of the debate can be really helpful for kind of setting up the burdens that you want to resolve later on. I think at a link level, there's a lot of link ground here, and the objective for the link arguments for most cat teams is just to say that the affirmative organizing model, in whatever way it creates practice for spilling up to resolve the magnitude of its impacts or capitalism, is wrong and insufficient. And I think that because of this, you really want to be able to set up barriers that the alt model can overcome but the AF can't, making arguments about how individualized forms of resistance that I think a lot of critical AFs sometimes run to, and how that doesn't allow the creation of collective means of resistance, can be really good if you have an explanation of how that barrier becomes imposed, which you can do through the process of example debating, i.e. explaining how individual resistance doesn't actually culminate in the ability for us to resist on a much broad-based level, and making examples of the way in which that stops like really effective organizing models. I think is really a good question for where you want to set up maybe a lot of your central link arguments, and where I think you want to make a lot of your examples comparable. But I also think this is a place where your proximate cause arguments are winnable, because I think that when you could say that the kind of over focus on one particular structural aspect that the AFME has doesn't allow us to think about the like way in which capitalism both magnifies and makes possible the impacts to the AF, and thus that kind of misdiagnosis doesn't give us a good ideological principle to organize or mobilize around. And being able to make that argument about how that gets exported to the level of praxis can flow really well with a lot of the arguments that you want to make above about the difference between organizing models. Hopefully you like this start to the Cap K series in terms of the relationship that it has to critical affirmatives, and hopefully you'll tune in for the next part of the series.